Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea DeHaan. I am the Outreach Coordinator for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I welcome you to today's presentation as part of our pre-law series in the college. We are very excited about our guest today, but before I tell you more about her, I want to tell you a little bit about how we'll be conducting this webinar in case you haven't joined us for our series before. You do have the ability to let us know that you're here by saying hello in the chat. So I'd encourage anyone who's participating today to go ahead and let us know who you are or what your major is, or if you're interested in a particular area of law, feel free to give us a shout out in the chat. You'll also notice at the bottom of your screen that you have a Q&A feature. That Q&A feature will enable you to ask questions, and my co-host, Dan Matthews, the advisor for pre-law in the college, will be helping to monitor that Q&A throughout, and he will be asking those questions of our guest at the end. So don't be shy. If something comes up during conversation that you want to make sure it gets asked, feel free to populate that as we go. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end to throw your questions in then. And you can find information about the presentations that are taking place today, as well as previous presentations and any upcoming presentations at our website, the CHAS Alumni Lunch Series page. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our guest today, RonNell Andersen Jones, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our guest before turning the time over to her. RonNell is an affiliated fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and the Teitelbaum Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. A former newspaper reporter and editor, Professor Jones is a First Amendment scholar who teaches, researches, and writes on legal issues affecting the press and on the intersection between media and the role of the press as a check on government. She is also a widely cited national expert on reporters' privilege and news gathering rights, and a regular speaker on emerging areas of social media law and defamation and privacy issues as they affect the media. She is an advisor on the American Law Institute's reinstatement of the law third torts, defamation and privacy. Her scholarly work has appeared in numerous books and journals, including Northwestern Law Review, Michigan Law Review, UCLA Law Review, Washington University Law Review, and the Harvard Law Review Forum. She is also a regular public commentator on press freedom issues, and her op-eds have been published in several major news outlets, including CNN and the New York Times, and her research has been quoted in Newsweek, the Washington Post, Vanity Fair, and the New York Times, among other national publications. Professor Jones graduated first in her law school class and clerked for the Honorable William A. Fletcher of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the United States Supreme Court. Prior to entering academia, she was an attorney on the Issues and Appeals section of Jones Day, where her work focused on Supreme Court litigation and included major constitutional cases. These are all incredibly relevant experiences when we think about the news of the day, and we are incredibly excited to have our alum from the journalism program, RonNell Andersen Jones, joining us today. RonNell, welcome, and I'd love to turn the time over to you.
Great, thanks so much for that nice introduction. It's great to be here. It would be even greater to be in Logan. I always say yes to things from Utah State, primarily because of the excuse to get to go to Logan, because it's one of my favorite places in the whole world. And those of you who get the chance to study there should feel really lucky. But even though I have to, the circumstances require me to participate remotely today, I'm still really thrilled to get the chance to talk to some Aggies and to get the chance to tell a little bit about my life in the law, the route that I took to get where I am today. And particularly, as I was sort of saying to Dan before we started, it's really important to me as an alum to talk about the fact that sort of where you sit now is where I once sat, and where I sit now is where you could once sit in the future, if that's of interest to you. There are lots and lots of paths to the world of law, lots of trajectories. The one I took is typical in some ways and really, really atypical in others. So what I thought I might do is just spend a couple of minutes describing for you my own story, where I began, the steps that I took along the way, my path to the law and my jobs in the law, just so you can get a sense of what I've done for a living and what prepared me to do those things for a living. And along the way, I think I'll sort of pepper my comments with some information about the ways other people have done it differently, just so that you have a sense of the kinds of trajectories and the kinds of paths that might exist. After that, Dan suggested that it might be helpful. I am a professor of law right now. I've been an associate dean at 2 different law schools, and I've been on the admissions committee at 3 different law schools. And so I can offer up a couple of tips about how to prepare now, if law school is something that might be on deck for you in the future, how to choose a law school once you find yourself in the application cycle and preparing to do that, and how to be a good law student once you're there. I want to make sure that I save a lot of time for Q&A, because I'm most interested in meeting the needs that you all have and answering the questions that you all have. But I'm hoping that along the way, a bit of my narrative will resonate with you as something that will help you to think about your planning, and it will also help you think about the ways that people who start out where you are can end up having long, happy, fulfilling careers in the law. Okay, so by way of just sort of starting background, I graduated from Utah State with degrees in journalism and political science. And they were both incredibly valuable for me as sort of a leaping off point for my study of the law. I'm always thrilled when I see journalism students, journalism majors in the pile when I'm on an admissions committee at a law school, because a lot of the skills that one needs in order to be a successful journalist or a successful student of journalism are really translatable to the world of law. You are thinking about the issues of the day. You're thinking about sort of taking difficult, complex policy questions and narrowing them down into arguments that are digestible and understandable and coherent, and sort of leading with the things that are most important and working your way backwards. Some of my very best performing law students in terms of performance on law school time pressured exams have been former journalism students, because they're really, really good at writing under deadline, right? At getting the important stuff up at the top, making sure that they think creatively about the way that they communicate, and making sure that they are simple and clear and precise in their communications. And so journalism was a great background for me. I was also really, really happy to have studied political science in undergrad. And I think that's a valuable thing to spend some time doing on your way to law school. At least some portion of the required courses the first year of law school tap into some of the things that I studied as an undergrad. And I was really happy to have a background knowledge about the operation of government, and a background knowledge about the ways that policy debates take place inside and outside of government. It was really helpful for me to have sort of just the very basics of an education in econ, to be able to think about cost benefit analyses, to be able to think about the way that different groups negotiate outcomes in different settings. It was super helpful to me just to have a very basic knowledge of both world history and the history of the American government in order to be able to operate well within law school. All of that being said, law schools are filled with students from a wide, broad, diverse background. And in fact, the very best law schools are working really, really hard to make sure that their admissions are not solely focused on people who have history degrees or political science degrees, or English or communications degrees that are perhaps more traditionally thought of as the pre-law path. I'm always so happy when my class of first-year students has a great mix, right? The person who was the music major, and the person who was the engineering student, and the person who studied chemistry, and the person who studied business, in part because, especially in the first year of law school, the breadth of the curriculum is so wide, right? You're going to be studying contracts law and property law and constitutional law. And it's wonderful to have a mix of people who have studied different things as undergrads, and who have had different life experiences and different work experiences in those spaces, to be able to bring some real world sort of boots on the ground reality to those spaces. So there definitely is no one path to a JD, there are lots of ways to make whatever it is that you've chosen to study in your undergraduate years interesting and exciting on a law school application. The path that I took really worked for me, and it turned out to be really, really important and valuable to me in my practice. So when I ultimately became a First Amendment lawyer, I spent a lot of time reflecting on a lot of things that I had learned in undergrad in journalism. And the same is true in my career as an academic. I write and research a lot about the rights of the press and the First Amendment values of press freedom. And I still routinely am drawing upon things that I learned as an undergraduate at Utah State in that space. After undergrad, I went to graduate school and was a working journalist during the time that I was in graduate school. And then after that, went to law school. So I didn't go straight through from undergrad to law school. And I think both of those paths are interesting and valid. And we always like to have in our law school class at the U, a good mix of people who came straight from undergrad and people who have done other things, graduate school, working stints, transitioning careers from other places. Both bring a lot to the table in terms of what you can offer to a class and what you can offer to your own legal career. When I went to law school, I went with a goal of doing something that wouldn't leave my journalism past behind. I had been a working journalist. I was really, really interested in the intersection between the press and the courts, and in those two institutions, journalism as a democratic institution and the courts as a democratic institution. And all I knew was that I was committed to continuing a life of that. I entertained very seriously the possibility of weaving back into journalism after law school and becoming a journalist who covered the courts with a JD. Some of the very best court journalists, legal journalists in the country are people who have studied both journalism and law and then have returned to the world of journalism. Some of those people are now good friends of mine. People like Adam Liptak at the New York Times and Bob Barnes at the Washington Post are people who think they wear a journalist hat, but they are lawyers at base, and the court is as much their institution as the press is. And so I spent some time thinking about doing journalism through a law lens, and ultimately ended up doing law through a journalism lens. So after law school, I practiced for a couple of years at Jones Day Rivas and Pogue. It's a big national law firm. Jones Day is, I think, still the largest firm in the country. It has offices in New York and DC, a couple of Midwestern cities, a couple of big cities in Texas. I worked at the San Francisco office, and then did a lot of work for the DC office in their Supreme Court practice. So they had associates who worked all across the country, who were working for partners who were in DC. We went to DC for the arguments, but we were working from other offices. I was in practice for a bit, and then wove out for clerkships, and then back to practice. I wanted to spend just a second talking about judicial clerkships, which were some of the most fulfilling, most rewarding, and most educational of the legal jobs that I've had in my life. If you just sort of put a gun to my head and said to me, like, you have to choose one job that you do forever for your whole life in the law, it would be a really close tie between the one that I do now, which is a professor of constitutional law, and going back to working as a law clerk in the judiciary. Law clerks are basically the sort of mini law firm that works for a federal judge or a state court judge. Both of my clerkships were in the federal system. So I clerked on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit for a judge named William Fletcher, who is based in San Francisco at the federal courthouse there. And then I clerked for Justice O'Connor, who was a justice of the United States Supreme Court at the US Supreme Court in DC. And in both of those settings, the job was essentially to be a mini team of lawyers for the judge. And it's an incredibly rewarding thing to do because, and particularly refreshing after you've been in legal practice for a little while before it, because when you're in legal practice, you work really hard and sort of earnestly sort of represent your client's interests. But your job when you sit down to write the brief for the court is to persuade the court to find in favor of your client. And you're an advocate on behalf of a client's set of interests. When you're a law clerk, the only outcome that you're sort of advocating for is the right one. So you work for the judge and you read and digest the filings that are made by the two parties in each case. And you help the judge engage in the kind of research of precedent and of the sort of policy ramifications of particular outcomes, and then write memos that are called bench memos. They are memos to the person who sits on the bench to describe what the arguments are on both sides and to describe what the law dictates in a particular setting. And one of the really great things about a clerkship immediately after law school graduation is that it gives you the chance to sort of, it's sort of like a postdoc, right? The chance to sort of keep studying the law, but in a more real world context. So I got to see law that was practiced incredibly well. I also got to see law practiced incredibly poorly, right? I got to see the kind of lawyer I wanted to be and the kind of lawyer I definitely didn't want to be. I got to taste a lot of the most exciting issues of the day, most controversial legal topics of the day. I got the chance to work and develop mentoring relationships with some brilliant federal judges who remain very close, important people to me to this day. And a clerkship is a really valuable way to make connections within the legal community. The people with whom I clerked 15 years ago are now federal judges themselves, and law professors and partners in charge of major law firms. So it gave me the chance to make connections that remain valuable to me in my own career, but also really valuable to me as a professor who can make connections for my students to those folks. And so as you think about law and the study of law, you might think about making a clerkship a goal, and thinking creatively during law school about the ways that you can prepare yourself for those applications. After I clerked, I went back into practice for a bit, and then and my practice was all appellate law. So I worked as an appeals lawyer. I was in the issues and appeals section at Jones Day, which means that we didn't do any work in my group. My firm certainly did, but in my group, we didn't do any work at the trial level. We were all of the work that we did were cases that had already been to trial and that were being argued before an appellate court. And that meant that we didn't get into the details of juries or investigating facts, subpoenas or depositions. Instead, we took the case fully baked. The case existed as it existed. And it was a much more, in some respects, sort of intellectual endeavor. We were taking a single isolated legal issue and thinking about it creatively and trying to persuade courts how to think about the law in a more sort of a concrete legal way. Often it was the interpretation of a particular statute or the interpretation of a particular constitutional provision. And it gave us the chance to really, gave me the chance to hone my research and writing skills and to think in really, I think, important ways that became important to me as an academic down the road. So after practice, I transitioned to academia. I became a law professor first by doing a visiting associate professorship at the University of Arizona. And then I transitioned to the full-time legal academic market. And I've worked now at 3 law schools and now teach at the University of Utah's S.J. Quinney College of Law, a place where I hope, I was saying to you, to Dan before the call, before the conference started, that I hope and expect to see applications from lots of you in the coming couple of years as you apply to law school at the U. If at any point it is interesting to you to sit in on a constitutional law course when you're in the process of applying, our admissions office is really generous about making sure that people have the opportunity to sit in and to think about sort of trying law school on for size and trying the U on for size. And I'm always the head of the line for those volunteering for those opportunities. So if it is interesting to you to sit in on a con law class and you're a junior or senior who is in the process of applying to law schools, reach out to our admissions committee and ask about that, because I would be very happy to have you sit in virtually this coming year or in person after that. I think it can be a really valuable thing for an applicant to law school to sit in on a Socratic discussion. The way that we teach at a law school is quite different from the way that undergrad and even graduate studies can sometimes operate. It's very question-based. It's very sort of hot in its exchange. I ask a lot more questions than I answer. As a law professor, I spend a lot of time giving my students the chance to practice the skills that they will need when they are lawyers, giving them the chance to think on their feet, to describe the facts to me, to describe the law to me, to answer when pressed about their answers. And that Socratic setting, I think, is quite foreign to a lot of students in the application cycle. So it can be really fun for you to sit in and observe it, and it can also give you sort of the chance to envision yourself and to envision what those next steps might look like. So if that's something that's interesting to you, shoot me a note or shoot a note to Reyes Aguilar, who is our Dean of Admissions. I'm positive he'd be happy to help you arrange for that. Okay, so a set of other things that I wanted to make sure, that's sort of my life path, my career path. It's not the one and only path, and it's not even, in some respects, a totally common path. But there are a couple of sort of high points and takeaways from it. I did not come from a family of lawyers. My dad was a rancher. I grew up in Box Elder County in a community that's close to the Utah-Idaho border. And in fact, we didn't even really know lawyers. I think maybe the first lawyer that my dad knew really, really well was me after I became a JD. And that might be true from your own family history, but is not in any way preclusive of a really satisfying career in the law. And increasingly, law schools are recognizing the value of having folks who are first generation law students and who bring really important representation to both to our law school and our community of learners, but also to the profession in more global ways. So if that's who you are and what you're trying to do, I applaud it. And I also am very happy to try to act as a mentor and be helpful as you sort of sort through some of the things that I had to work to sort through when I was a student. Let me just spend a couple of minutes thinking about how to prepare now to get into law school, and then how to choose a law school, and then finally just sort of how to be a good law student once you get there. Preparing to get into law school in some respects requires of you that you do the things that everybody already thinks you ought to be doing. If you are working hard and focusing on your studies, and you are spending a lot of time developing a sense of intellectual curiosity and a sense of connection to the world around you, and are turning yourself into a person who cares deeply about a range of issues and gives freely of your time to those issues, you're on the right path. Those are the kinds of things that law schools are looking for, and you can create them artificially, but you can also just over the course of your natural time as an undergrad, it turns out that people who are well suited for the law very often have those sets of things already happening for them. As I said, there's no one clear academic path or major that is important, although you will be happy if you have worked hard to hone your research skills, your reading skills, and your writing skills. I do find sometimes that students who come from the hard sciences struggle a little bit at the writing component of law school. They haven't given themselves enough practice in sort of long form writing under time pressure or engaging in persuasive writing, but those are things that are easily overcome with some practice, right? Or with peppering your schedule, your curriculum in undergrad with opportunities to take writing courses and to get yourself to a place where you are careful and thoughtful at that. Conversely, there are folks who come from writing heavy programs who sometimes don't have the full depth of research and thinking skills that you might want to have honed or developed. So think about ways that you can stretch yourself in those fronts. Think about making yourself increasingly more aware of public events, of the world around you, of public issues, of the policy debates of the day. I think some of the very best law students who come to us have prepared themselves by just being consumers of kind of like really thoughtful long form journalism, right? The kind of person who reads articles in Politico and the Atlantic and tries really hard to think about what's going on sort of beyond the cable news talking heads, but to get interested and aware of some of the issues of the day. Those are the people who tend to perform most well and to be most comfortable, particularly in the public law courses in the constitutional law curriculum that I teach. The other thing that you can do, I think, to prepare yourself for a law school application is to think really carefully about the ways that you can sort of package and brand yourself as a student and as an applicant. Think creatively about the things that are unique about you in comparison to the other schools, the other applicants to the school, and think about the particular school. Think really carefully about tailoring a cover letter to the school to which you are applying rather than having a one-size-fits-all cover letter. There are certain things about you that might be super interesting to sort of other regional schools that are outside of the state that might make you pretty parallel and pretty similar to other applicants within the state. And so thinking about the ways that you're unique within those particular pools can be really valuable. On the question of how to choose a law school at the application process time, which Dan says is a topic of significant interest in the group, I think that applying broadly is always the right answer. It's uniformly the right answer, even if you think that you have no interest in moving and you think that you have no interest in affiliating with any schools beyond, even if you know for sure the school that you want to go to and that you think you can get into it. It's better to have options than to not have options. And it is, it's most ideal as you're applying to think about a sort of set of safety schools that you are certain your GPA and LSAT scores will get you into, a set of mid-level schools that you think are a bit of a reach, and a sort of maybe some super reach schools that lightning might strike, and there might be something about your application that would be super appealing to them to get you in. Thinking regionally can be really important of the law school application timeframe. So thinking about the legal market in which you want to work, and the connections that the law school has to that market, right? Ask those specific questions, right? I would like to work in the Salt Lake market. What connections do you all have? What percentage of your students go on to work in that market? What ways could you prepare me for being able to do that kind of work? Increasingly, I think students do ask the sort of overlapping questions between the admissions office at a law school and the career services office at a law school. And I think being thoughtful about the game plans that you have can be really useful. My overarching advice about sort of career services at law schools and careers in general in the law is not to try to make your decision about what you think you want to do on the other end of law school too early. Lots of people arrive at law school with a game plan, and I applaud them. And often those people end up executing on that game plan, right? They come, they know they want to be a criminal defense attorney. They focus on criminal defense opportunities. They go to the law school that has the best criminal defense or victims' rights clinic. They find summer work that is in that space, and then they catapult themselves into that kind of work. But for every person who is like that, there's a person on the other end who is a lot like me, right? Arrives at law school. Now, I didn't know for sure what I wanted to do, in part because I didn't know what the choices were. I didn't know, I had not explored the entirety of the law. I didn't know that there was a difference, for example, between people who did trial work and people who did appellate work. I wouldn't have said that I wanted to be an appellate lawyer if you asked me on my first day of law school. But certainly by midway through my second year, I was certain that appellate work was the work that I wanted to do. I had done enough of it in various practicum settings in law school, and I had come to know sort of the different skill sets that are required for trial work and appellate work. And then it became really clear to me that that was the path to practice that I wanted to take. And similarly, I mean, one of the really great and awful things about law school is that it's a little bit like getting chucked back into like middle school, your first year of law school. You have no control whatsoever over your course decision-making your first year of law school. It's completely dictated, or at most good schools, almost entirely dictated by the law school itself and by the American Bar Association's determinations about what a first-year curriculum should look like. And the curriculum almost perfectly maps onto the bar exam, the exam that you'll have to take 3 years later in order to become a licensed attorney within the state of your choosing. So it's broad, it has breadth and it has depth. It's like dipping your toe in all the different kinds of law that might exist over the course of your first year of law school. So you study some contracts and you study some torts, which are private lawsuits, individual lawsuits privately against two parties, like personal injury law. You study a little bit of criminal law, a little bit of constitutional law and government. You study, you get the very basics of civil procedure, the kind of rules of how courts operate and work. And it turns out that in any given law school class, people sort of sort out as to sort of loving those different spaces. The people who really gravitate to contracts law are not people who are super keen on constitutional law, and vice versa. But a lot of people come thinking that the kind of law that they had in mind, right, maybe the kind that they've seen practiced in their own families, or that they've seen practiced in the media, or that they expect would sort of align with their own ideological or other preferences, turn out not to be the thing that really lights them on fire, turn out to be not where their own skill set lies. And so keeping an open mind, coming to law school, taking the first year, like just drinking from the fire hose that first year, and really having an open mind about what the curriculum has to offer before you start charting a path too seriously after that, I think can sometimes be a really healthy and valuable path. Finally, a handful of a couple of tips about how to go about being a good law student once you arrive. And I have a few things to convey on this front that have been important, I think, to the successes of the students that I've had over the years. I was trying, as I was preparing for this, to think about common traits, things that I see turn out to be true of the people who perform best, right? Of the people who have the best experiences in law school and turn out to be the most successful on the other end of it. And there's a small number of things that is true of the vast majority of people who end up performing well. The first, and like I think just sort of primary, is that thing that they share is that they are almost insatiably intellectually curious. These are people who wonder, right? Who want to know about things, who wonder why the world works the way that it does, who don't always 100% accept that the way the world works is the way that it ought to continue working, right? Who dare to question, who sort of plumb the depths of things, who have found themselves in their past lives questioning how things work, and who are interested in sort of mapping solutions onto problems. That's the mark of a good law student, and it turns out to be the mark of a good lawyer. The law is a really noble profession. It's a profession that is filled with people who want to put their considerable intellectual resources to work making change in our society, in our organizations, in our institutions, in our businesses, and in our world. And you can see that already. You can see the spark of that already in the first year of law school amongst the very best students. So being a person who cares to ask questions, who dares to ask questions, right? When you don't know what's going on, who dares to sort of do the deeper dive to try to figure out what's happening. I have a memory of it was sometime during my first week of law school. I think it was probably day 2 or 3. There was a woman I made friends with at orientation. She remains a good friend of mine to this day, Amy and I. We were brand new baby law students together, and we had a case that had been assigned for our torts class. And we decided to sit together in the library and work our way through this case. And it was so tedious for us. We had the case book open to us, and we had the Black's Law Dictionary, which is sort of the dictionary that translates legal terms. And we were looking up almost every word. It was like trying to do like a Google Translate, one word at a time, all the way through the case to sort of get our way through just the most basic of terms, right? Reminding ourselves who the plaintiff was and who the defendant was and what it meant for there to be a motion before a court and what it meant for the particular language to have been argued in the particular way. And I remember thinking, if this is the pace at which we are going to do this, we're really sunk. We're never going to be able to perform at the level that we need to perform. And I remember Amy said to me, we just have to stick with it. Surely some of this will get easier, right? Like that was the best like pep talk that she could offer, was just surely it couldn't get harder. So surely some of this will get easier. And it did get easier. It got so much easier. We remained study partners throughout law school. And by the end, right, we were reading with great fluency. We had learned the language of the law. We were challenging ourselves and challenging each other. We were both performing really well in law school and went on to do really interesting things afterwards. So be patient with yourself, but allow yourself to be to play out those intellectual curiosities. That's the mark of a good law student. A good law student figures out how to find balance in her life. And that is a very, very hard thing, particularly for the kinds of folks that law schools often attract. Law schools attract achievers, people who are interested, people who are competitive, people who are interested in performing well, people who are driven, and sometimes competitiveness and a sort of driven personality inures to your benefit, and sometimes it works against you, right? When you have difficulty maintaining the kind of balance that you need to have in your life. So work really hard in the run-up as you're preparing for law school to set the structures in place in your life that you need to have in place to make sure that you have healthy habits, that you have healthy habits that you stick with, that you have healthy relationships with people who can act as a check on you and who can remind you what matters and what doesn't matter, who can give you a sense of perspective, that you have a good support system, that you have a good plan in place for maintaining that kind of work life and school life balance. If you can't do that in law school, you'll have a very, very hard time doing it as a lawyer because the pressures don't get less and the work doesn't get any less important, and your drive to succeed will not wane in the aftermath. And so figuring out using law school, and in fact, using your undergraduate years to try to hone those kind of broader skills, I think will be really important. Finally, the very best law students that I know are connectors of people. They build a wide network of connections during law school and beyond that help them both in those sort of emotional support ways that I just described, but also professionally. And to this day, I know lots and lots of people, right? A lot of my friends who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s who continue when they sort of have a problem they need to solve, they go back to a law school classmate, right? They go back to try to find somebody from their law school class who has the expertise in that area, who has that capacity, who can help connect them, who they can trust. And thinking of yourself as starting your legal career the very day that you walk into law school is a really important thing to do. Thinking of these people as your lifelong professional colleagues will serve you well. It will mean that you're the kind of law student who takes advantage not just of what the law school has to offer academically, but also what it has to offer in a broader professional way. I often tell my law students that the very biggest gift that we as a law school give to them is each other. That network of alums who will be who have been through the same experience as you, who know you and who you can trust, and who will have a breadth and depth of professional expertise and connectivity in the future that you're going to want to draw upon. So thinking carefully about maintaining those relationships and developing professionalism early on can be really important. Okay, so I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time to answer any questions that that you all have. But many, many thanks for giving me the chance to come back and to talk to all of you and to reflect upon things. And I look forward to long and good relationships with all of you. Please do reach out if I can be helpful.
Thank you so much, RonNell. That has just great number of insights for students, and it's so great to hear your perspective as well as somebody who works with current law students. I think that'll be incredibly helpful for anyone who's considering law school or thinking about, how they can carefully both position themselves to get into law school, but also to succeed once they're in law school. I'm going to turn the time over now to my co-host, Dan Matthews, who's going to lead us through some questions. But I do want to remind our listeners today that if you have questions, RonNell has been incredibly generous with her time today and is here to answer those questions. So please take advantage of this opportunity and don't be shy. So if you have questions, feel free to continue to add those to the Q&A. And Dan, I will turn things over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for what you've given us so far. We've got a couple of questions here. The first one says, you seem to be astonishingly successful, well-deserved, no doubt. I would agree with that. What advice do you have for someone who is striving for similarly high goals, but won't be going to an Ivy League or T14 school?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I'm a person who is completely, absolutely convinced that a prestigious school isn't a prerequisite to success in the law and even to other well-credentialed opportunities within the law. The law is, we can just put that out there, it is a super snobby profession, right? It has layers and layers of elitism externally, but also internally in terms of schools and in terms of credentials and it's a very credential heavy business. And it has a way of feeding back onto itself in ways that I do not applaud and indeed have condemned, where people who have certain credentials tend to think that those credentials are the most important credentials, right? So, so we've discovered when we in the clerkship application process, for example, judges who themselves served on a law review when they were in law school are the ones who tend to think that law review is an absolute must for the students who apply to them. In part, this is because we only know what we know, right? We only know the experiences that were valuable and helpful and good to us. And it's hard for us to see that people who didn't have those identical experiences might also have something to bring to the table. That said, there are amazing, top, great lawyers in all positions in government and the profession who did not graduate from T14 or elite Ivy schools. And in fact, I am often asked, like if I had my own legal problem, who would I hire? And I know the person that I would hire. And the person that I would hire is a guy who went to Ohio State University and did not graduate at the top of his class. But he's the best lawyer I know. He's the sort of most thoughtful, connected, talented, hardworking lawyer that I know. And I am 100% convinced, if you gave me an unlimited budget, and I had my own legal problem that was unique and personal to me, he is the person I would hire. And those kinds of reputational gains, they're earned by good lawyers everywhere without those sorts of credentials. It's also the case that some of the snobby credentials that people within the law really, really do care about, that sort of are the mark of elitism, some of the most important of those are available at all law schools, right? All law schools have a law review and an editor-in-chief of that law review. All law schools have a ranking system whereby you can graduate, we call it Order of the Coif. It's a society for folks who graduated in the top 10% of their class, sort of it's roughly equivalent to magna cum laude and summa cum laude in the Latin honor system. All law schools have opportunities for students to participate in prestigious fellowships within their law school. All law schools have opportunities for the very best students to work hard in directed research programs and to publish academic work to contribute to the legal scholarship. And so I am a big believer that one should bloom where one is planted, right? I do think it's important to think about what your long-term career goals are. There are some long-term career goals for which getting into and attending the very strongest law school that you can get into in terms of US News ranking will make a difference, right? Right, you should go in with sort of clear eyes about the short set of things that you might want to do for a living within the law where it really, really matters, where it could give you a real edge to have those sorts of credentials. And then think more concretely about the sort of wide array of other things within the law, wherein that kind of US News ranking determination about a law school probably isn't the savviest or even most useful way for you to strategize your path forward, and figuring out how to be successful at the place where you do land is much more important.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. We've got a couple here that are kind of related. So the first one is, with your experience on the admissions board at law schools, what is the most appealing thing from applicants? And I guess I'd branch that out a little bit. What are there specific types of things that that certain schools look at, and how would you tailor your application to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Starting with the bad news, the bad news is that the mechanism by which law schools are ranked by their outside accreditors, so particularly US News and World Report, which is sort of the master overlord to which all law schools, the altar at which all law schools worship, US News ranking matters a lot. It matters a lot to law schools, and it matters a lot to their sort of ongoing brand viability and reputation within the wider legal community. And so the US News ranking and the criteria that US News superimposes upon law schools tends to drive a lot of the decision-making at the admission stage. And what that means is that the two criteria that US News weights most heavily, which are LSAT scores and undergraduate GPAs, tend to be major deciding factors at a lot of law schools. Most law schools have a very firm target goal of the sort of median LSAT and median GPA and what they want their top and bottom quartile to look like in terms of those numbers, and are going to work really hard to achieve it. And so it would be a lie for us to suggest that the numbers are not a major thing that a lot of law schools are looking at. And indeed, at least some law schools, there's an initial filtering that is happening before anyone lays eyes on the applications themselves to determine whether you would be above median in the LSAT or above median at the GPA. One sort of insider tip, although it probably is no longer all that insider, is getting yourself above median on one of those two fronts is often enough, right? Because they're medians, right? It would be fantastic if you are what we think of as a high. That is, let's imagine a law school that has a median LSAT of 160 and a median GPA of 3.7. you would love to be the person who is applying to that law school with a 161 and a 3.75, right? You're a high for them. You're above median on both fronts, and that brings a lot to the table and gets you put in a pretty valuable pile at the very beginning. But if you are only one of those things and you're in okay shape on the other front, you can craft a package as like what we might think of, what you might label a high-low, right, or a low-high. You're a person who comes to the table with a 3.9 GPA, but your LSAT score isn't great and is below their median. You have an LSAT that wouldn't put them in a place that would serve their median goals. You can sort of ride really heavily that GPA, and then the likelihood that somebody's laying eyes on your application is really high, and then you spend your time making your application sing in ways that convince the law school that you bring something special to the table, right? Something about your upbringing, something about your experiences, something about your life goals, something about the quality of your hard work. All of those things are really valuable. Conversely, if you're a person whose GPA isn't looking like it's going to hit the targets of the above median targets at some of the law schools that are most interesting to you, you know what your task is, right? Your task is to throw your energy into the LSAT, right? To think about taking a very, very good LSAT prep course. There are some components of the LSAT that you can teach yourself to do, right? With enough practice, there are some things that show up on the LSAT. I've seen lots and lots of promising applicants raise their LSAT score really significantly with some good LSAT practice and LSAT instruction. And so thinking about how to balance those out is a really good thing. One of the things that you might want to make sure that you do is think quite carefully about your letters of recommendation. Not all recommendation letters are created equal, and recommendation letters that suffice for other purposes sometimes are not particularly helpful in the law school application process, right? A boss that you had a couple of years ago who liked you a lot and who thinks that you're a wonderful person and will say so in writing might be a great recommendation letter to get you in the door for lots of things in the future, but might not really serve your application process if what you're trying to do is convince a law school that's on the fence because your numbers are adequate in one direction, but not in the other for purposes of their US News reporting. So thinking about people who can speak to your intellectual heft, right, to your sort of academic candle power, who can talk with specificity about projects you've seen across the finish line, about your problem solving skills, about your work ethic in an academic setting. If you are early in your undergraduate career, start making those connections. Do it in a really, really calculated, strategic way. Say so out loud to professors with whom you meet. I'm hoping one day to be able to go to law school. I would love for the chance to do some work with you that would put me in a place where you could speak. You could better speak to my writing or research skills, right? Remind them of the kinds of things that you've done and that they've seen you do. Undergraduate professors, I have lots of friends who teach undergraduate, big undergrad classes where they don't have lots of opportunity to get to know people on a one-on-one level. And they tell me that it's a lot easier for them to write rec letters for students who make it easier for them, right? Who make themselves known to them, who when you reach out to ask for that letter, you remind them, right? I was in your, American history class last year. You'll remember I wrote the project on X. That paper is attached. I was happy to earn an A on that project and to get the following pieces of feedback from you. You remind them back to them about the interactions that they had with you and give them some material, the sort of goods to use when they're reflecting sort of shining the mirror on you to the law school admissions council. The difference between sort of a mediocre, lukewarm letter and a great letter can make a big difference. I've seen it see people across the finish line in close cases at law school admissions. And sometimes people are sort of just overly humble or awkward in those dynamics. And now is not the time for false modesty, right? This is not the moment to be shy, particularly if you did perform really well for someone, right? It behooves you to remind them of that, right? Just to say, and you do it in a way that's completely professional, and that is, in case it's helpful to you, I wanted to remind you, and then you put some bullet points of the things that they may well not remember because they have so many students and because people have been involved. And then you offer to meet with them or to discuss by phone if it would be helpful, that you understand that they're busy and that you wanted to give them plenty of time in which to think it through. But if they are willing and able to do this, it would be wonderfully helpful to you, right? And if you package it up in that way, I can see the letters that get produced through that cycle, and I can see the letters that get produced just through a sort of awkward exchange where somebody says, could you write me a quick letter? And they give them not enough time and not enough information. And it's a sort of paragraph, and it tends to sort of damn with fake praise, right? He was a fine student. She was in my class and did well, right? Things that don't give enough narrative structure for an admissions committee to make something of. What you want to do is try to think about, there is a person out there. You don't know about this person, but there's a person, sometimes that person is me, right? Who sits on the admissions committee at a particular law school, who has pulled your file and likes you, right? Who is like, this package is attractive. I think I'm gonna go to the mat for this person. I'm gonna advocate for this person to get in. And you wanna give them as many tools as you can, right? You wanna give them as many arguments that they can make to the wider committee about why you should be there. And rec letters are a really important piece of that.
Okay, I've got one here that, it just rings really true with me because I had this problem. It says, I'm interested in the law, but I get a bit intimidated by the prestige. Do you ever get imposter syndrome? If so, how do you manage it?
Yeah, you just got to let that go. And one thing that was really helpful to me over the course of my career in doing that is working with people who are exponentially smarter than me and exponentially better credentialed than I am, and exponentially more successful in terms of the things that they've achieved within the law. The judges for whom I clerked, for example, the people with whom I work closely at Yale, they all feel it too, right? The sort of, once you start to realize that people who have people to whom you look up and whose work you admire and who you know to be solid, thoughtful, interesting, important contributors to the world of the law, also sometimes wonder, right? Like, do I have it together? Did I deserve to get where I've gotten? Is it possible for me, right? Who struggle with self-doubt. If you can remind yourself of that, it's really, really helpful. It's super helpful to remind yourself that people who are working hard will often struggle with self-doubt, right? But it's part and parcel of being a person who is driven, who wants to work hard and who wants to achieve and who wants to be better. And having enough confidence to do what you love and to keep working hard at it, even when that self-doubt sets in, it makes all the difference. But to the extent that it's helpful, I've had the like rare privilege of rubbing shoulders with some of the very, very best and brightest in the world of law, and they all feel that same way. And I think that helps.
One thing that helped me is in law school, because it carried me in practice. I had a professor tell me, you can be right and still lose. I'm like, yeah, that happened quite a bit. So it happens quite a bit, yeah. I've got two more short questions here. It says, thank you. What is your take on the MLS at the U? I love my job and don't plan on practicing. Is it a good option for deepening my understanding of the law?
Yes, I think it's actually a really great program. The people who seem to be getting the most out of it and taking the most advantage of it are people who, it sounds like this questioner is describing, which is, I already have a career path. I already know the kind of thing I want to do, and I'm super happy at the job that I'm at. I just need to get myself right to a level of understanding or a level of credentialed within the space to be able to do that, to be able to sort of operate within the world of law with a greater sophistication, and to be able to tailor my understanding to the needs of my particular employer. My sense from my conversations with the people who have been, it's a fairly fledgling program. I think it's in its second or third full year. But I know a couple of people who have completed the program, and I know a lot of people who teach within the program. And their goal, I think, is really to make sure that they are meeting the internal professional goals of people who are already working within a particular space.
And the last one, and it's actually one I get a lot. Are all GPAs looked at equally, or do they take into account like engineering or math or, you know, et cetera?
That is such a good question. The US News answer is that all GPAs are created equal. And so if you have a 3.999 GPA from a not at all well-known school, not at all intellectually rigorous school, in a degree program that is not widely reviewed as being particularly challenging or intellectually hefty, it is the functional equivalent of the 3.99 GPA in economics from Princeton, right? In terms of US News, in terms of what that law school gets to report on its GPA front, they are the functional equivalent. Now, once you get past that numbers game and into the more sophisticated inquiry game, I think it changes radically, right? So lots and lots of cases I have seen where there are people who have LSAT scores that the law school likes, and then it's wondering what to do about the fact that it's what would be a below target median GPA, and then they burrow more deeply, right? And they say, let's look at this full package here, and it turns out that the full package is a GPA that isn't as high as we would like it to be, but look at the course load, right? Look at the curriculum that this person has studied, look at the competitive program that they were in, look at the caliber of school they were at. All of those things start to come into play. And so I think the answer is twofold. At the top level, it doesn't make any difference at all to a law school that's just trying to meet its targets for purposes of rankings. Once you get yourself in the door and looked at, it makes a huge difference in terms of the advocacy that somebody on a committee will make for your likely success as a student.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Are there any more questions from anybody that is out there? I'm not seeing them come in. I certainly appreciate your help and wonderful information for all of us. I'll turn the time back to Andrea.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dan said. Thank you so much, RonNell, for sharing your expertise, both as someone who works in academia and understands the law school process, but also giving us a sense for your career trajectory and the decisions along the way that, helped you find your place where you are today. So, and the work you do is just so fascinating. I feel like I myself could ask a lot of questions, but I know that we're out of time and we've really enjoyed talking to you. And I want to thank as well our audience. We had a great turnout today, and I appreciate that students, despite Zoom fatigue and snow in Logan, are making time to come out, at least virtually, and participate in these events with us. And I do want to just let students know that today is our last event for the fall semester, but please stay tuned for a spring 2021 lineup. We will continue the series in spring. It will be continued virtually, but we'll be putting information out about that for you to find. And if you have questions about today's event or anything else we do, feel free to reach out to me or to Dan. We'd be happy to help connect you with folks like RonNell. We're so pleased to have alumni who are willing to share their experiences and to come back and talk to students who currently stand where they once stood. So with that, I want to again thank our guest, thank our audience. Thank you, Dan, for co-hosting. And I want to wish everyone a safe and happy day. And thank you so much, everyone, for participating today. We so appreciate it.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Yep, it's great to see you.
Great to meet you. Thank you so much, RonNell.
Yep, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.